it's vital. I mean, look, we see this in Europe today. Energy is almost like as important as defense is to a country, because it's your independence and it's your access to technology. So today, again, what is necessary is for countries to realize if you want to develop your power industry, it's not just about building the distribution and trying to get people interested in power generation. It's about the right regulatory framework that is going to make it suitable and attractive for people to come and invest. And that regulatory framework has to be clear and it has to be predictable. And part of the problem we often find is that bureaucracy around that gets in the way of the investment. So, again, I think power generation, there's a huge amount more that could be done in cooperation between government and the private sector, and also the international financial institutions that today are prepared to invest in the power industry to a greater degree of benefit.
As you said, one of the big investors in Africa is China. A huge amount of foreign direct investment coming in from China. I mean, it's an increase from 6 billion in 2000 to over 110 billion in 2011. It's increased since and further. So what are the risks now for Africa? Because China is going through its own economic issues, and if the Chinese tap is turned off, what are the consequences for Africa? And especially from an African mining perspective, because all these infrastructure projects are vital for mining.
I think, you see, what the role of China in Africa needs is really the following kind of agenda. First of all, by the way, a lot of what China's brought into Africa has done a lot of good. So there are issues and problems in certain places for sure, but on the other hand, that massive investment, as you say, $100 billion, I mean, that is investment that is important for Africa. Secondly, though, African governments today, I think, look for options. One of the reasons why African governments today look to the UK and to the US alongside China, they look to Brazil, for example, now as a potential investor, is because they want a range of options. But thirdly, the reason why it's so important to diversify economically is precisely so that you are not subject to a fall-off in China. That means that there's a change in the commodity market and then your country's own economy gets depressed. So this is why the development of the service industries in countries is so important, and development of low-cost manufacturing power too. And for me, one of the other areas that I think is going to be really interesting is all around transportation, logistics, where it should be possible over time for African economies to insulate themselves somewhat from what's happening in the global markets.
Indeed, I mean, just maybe changing tack a little bit. I think that's an excellent answer. I accept what you're saying. I'll just angle a little bit to Ebola. We mentioned Ebola, and it's commendable that you're one of the only world leader that's actually visited many of the affected regions, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone. But of course, Ebola's hit a region which is, again, mining intensive. It's impacting investment decisions. And unlike you and your stand to go out there, many investors are shying away. So what would you say to those investors? Two, do you see it as a major threat? But thirdly, do you also see it as a failing in governance, that the response, do you feel the response was slow to deal with the crisis, and which allowed the crisis to get out of hand in the first place?
Right, the response was too slow. I don't think you'd be surprised that investors are scared off. And these Ebola countries now, hopefully we are coming to the end of the Ebola crisis, they've got a big challenge on their hands. But my point is, in fact, I think it's the Chinese who say the word for crisis is opportunity. In this crisis, there is a real opportunity. And let me just mention 3 elements to it. The first is, I have seen those governments act effectively, finally, okay, slow start, but finally act effectively to deal with the disease. A lot of outside help, but the focus, discipline, prioritization of those governments. What I keep saying to them now is take that lesson and apply it to normal government when normal times return. At least apply it to your healthcare system, because you've discovered things about your healthcare system that you didn't know, and they're of huge importance. The second thing is, look at what you can do as a range of different countries. If you take the Manu River countries, there's a massive amount they could be doing on infrastructure together, on investment together. You know, they should utilize those opportunities to come together. And thirdly, there will be donor support that is given to those countries in the post-Ebola reconstruction. Use it wisely and sensibly. In other words, learn the lessons from this, apply them, but also take steps that should have been taken a long time ago and that you can now see very visibly have to be taken to get your country on its feet again. And one of the things I'm absolutely passionate about as well, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, trade between Africa and Europe, you know, trade barriers and so on. Some of the biggest trade barriers in Africa are between countries. You know, some of the areas where you lose enormous amounts of efficiency are in costs and customs duties and various different forms of, frankly, informal trade. You could do a massive amount to improve the quality and health of those economies by dealing with some of those internal issues. So that's, you know, what we will want to do with my own teams. I've got full-time teams on the ground, all of those countries working with the presidents, is to say afterwards, let's learn the lessons, apply them, and let's get these countries also working together as to how they could utilize the money that will now come and help to build better, more sustainable systems in the future.
I'd like to talk about an issue which I think is largely ignored at Indaba, and that is the role of the trade unions. You, as I said, sat for a mining seat. You know the unions well and how they think. What advice would you give to companies and governments in handling unions?
I mean, I think, you see, I'll give you one of the problems when you stop being Prime Minister is you occasionally lapse into total frankness. My experience of trade unions is as follows. You basically have two types of union. You've got the unions that regard themselves as genuine industrial or service unions that represent the workforce, that realize that at a certain level there is a conflict between management and labour and capital, but at a higher level there's a combined enterprise. Right? And the better the company does, the better their members do. And then there's what I would say is a more politicized form of union, which I think can often be problematic. My view is that it is really important, particularly when you're dealing with industries where there's been a long history over time of poor working practices and exploitation. It's absolutely right that workers get proper representation and their living conditions and their working conditions are improved. My advice is and I think the best companies do this, is to give a genuine sense of partnership in the enterprise. When the politics comes in, it's very hard often to do anything that's going to be effective. But with that first, what I would call that first element of trade unions, you can see exactly the same divide in Europe, by the way, in trade unions. With that first element, those are people who want the company to succeed, but they want a fair share for those that they represent. That's fair enough if you can work with them. And I do honestly think that more that people understand that in the end, of course, there will be a difference of role between capital management and labour. At the highest level, all three have a combined interest in the enterprise succeeding.
I think just to follow up on that, I mean, you did mention in your speech local benefit is one of the key points that needs to be focused on. And do you think, looking from the outside, or actually you also advise many multinationals outside of the AGI, but looking at multinationals operating in Africa, do you think their corporate social responsibility policies and their approach to doing business in Africa, what would you advise them? How would you advise them to change it to improve the situation? Because partly the labour issues, if you just to quote one of the unionists at the time said that the part of the issue with what's happening with trade unions is that labourers feel that their communities are left out of the development and the success of the corporations they work for.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and I think, definitely today I would advise any company to pay a lot of attention to the broader social responsibility and to what happens in the community. But governments also got to facilitate that and facilitate it realistically. Companies come in, they make an investment, to make a profit for their shareholders. But the advice I would give is pretty obvious advice, which is, you're going into the community, you're going to be there for a significant period of time. Try and help the development of the community as much as possible. But you do need an echo from government. And you also need, people to realize that over time, industries change and communities change. You actually mentioned, Kristen, that my seat was a mining seat. But actually, when I became Member of Parliament, at that point, all the mines had closed. And, it's a very interesting thing about the process of change, because I'm always fascinated about how people make change work. And it's the most difficult thing, I think, in politics or business. But, we had a huge debate in the 1980s about what to do about the mining industry, because obviously it was starting to employ fewer people. And the Japanese, in the form of Nissan car company, at the time, came and asked to set up a car manufacturing plant in the northeast of the UK, just outside my constituency. And there was a huge debate about this, because many people from the older generation, and even the younger generation, said, what do we want the Japanese coming here for? Again, remember that in the 1980s it was the Japanese miracle, take over the country and so on and so forth. And I'll never forget, it was one of my first political meetings, it was a meeting at the town hall at Durham, where there was a heated debate about whether Nissan should be allowed to build this car plant. And the room was finally swayed by an old leader of the council, but who had been an official in the 1926 miners' strike. And he got up and said, look, I've lived all my life in this area. I spent 30 years down the mines. But I'm telling you, we've got to look for a different future. And if these Japanese people can come in and they can provide work, we should do. So in the end, Nissan built this car plant there. It's now one of the most successful in Europe. It actually helped transform the UK car industry. Now, my point is this, that with local communities, the mining community will be immensely important, but they're also going to have to undergo change over time. You want to be trying to diversify the local economy. And, that's where government has to employ sensible policies as well. So I don't think, it's not a one-way street. This is why I say, I think the best thing today is to look upon a mining investment. It's not simply a transaction, but the building of a relationship.
If we can now speak about ISIS, at what stage do the people in this room have to take account of ISIS in their strategic plan? How big a threat is ISIS?
In Africa, there are various elements that may associate with ISIS. The issue of extremism based on the Virtue of Islam, this radical Islamism, I think this is a big, big challenge for Africa. You can see it in Nigeria, you see it in Kenya, you see it right across the belt of Central Africa and elsewhere. And, this is probably something we're not going to better get into in detail in the minutes that remain, but I do believe this is probably the single biggest security challenge of our time. And I think we need both the force capability to defeat these people on the ground, and then we need to start rooting out the bad education systems that are educating young people to this radicalism. But, Africa is a place where traditionally, in many, many countries, there have been great relationships between people of different faiths, between Christians and Muslims. And I, for one, believe that the only world that's worth living in is one in which whatever your race or your faith or your culture, people have equal rights, equal respect and tolerance for all.
Ukraine, should the Americans and the West be arming Ukraine now?
Well, let's see what the outcome of the meetings will be once the General Chancellor has been with the President of the United States. But look, here's what I think very briefly. I'm not saying that Europe has handled this well in the lead up to the Ukrainian crisis, but the fact is you have a country which is an independent sovereign country on the doorstep of Europe, and it is undergoing a process of destabilization. Now, I agree entirely. There has to be a diplomatic solution to it, but I think that diplomatic solution is most likely to be achieved if there is also a show of strength. So I don't want to come across what is going to be happening in Minsk, I think, tomorrow, but let's hope that it can come to a solution. But in the end, my view is very simple: the Ukrainian people should be able to decide their own future.
And Mr. Cameron, over all of this, has been pretty invisible. I would imagine if you'd still been in number 10, you'd be more seen on the wider scene. Is that fair?
I don't know whether it's fair or not, but it's not very diplomatic. So, look at it. There's a lot going on in the UK right now. Look, for me, just leave aside David Cameron, we've got an election coming up and everything, I really don't want to get into that. But for me, any country in the world today has to decide where it stands and what its place is. And my view of Britain was always this: Britain's got a great history, but you can't live in your history. So, if you want to exercise influence today, if you're a country the size of Britain, you have to exercise it through alliances. And there are two big alliances for Britain: the United States of America, the European Union. The most powerful country in the world, and the largest political and commercial union in the world. And those are the two pillars, and on those pillars you can build all sorts of relationships. With the new powers, China, India, Brazil, and so on. But I think it's always important to realize that those alliances are at their most determined when there's a crisis and when there's difficulty. So, I think it's just important for us right now as a country and as part of Europe, an ally of the United States, to play our full part. And I'm sure, by the way, the country wants to. It's always difficult for countries in today's world to work out who your ally should be and how you do it. But in my view, standing up for the values that we believe is important.
I think I have one final question, and I'll make it a short answer for you. We talked about Harold Macmillan 50 years ago here in Cape Town. About that same time, I believe your father was working as a teacher in Sierra Leone. At that time, and I've heard you quote this before, Sierra Leone's GDP was about the same as South Korea. Today, obviously, it's not. So in your view, in your opinion, in a short statement, obviously Africa's missed several opportunities. What is the one thing Africa needs to focus on now to change that and attain its true development potential?
Government. Focus on the quality of government. If you get government that is transparent and effective in today's world where capital is mobile, technology is mobile, you can make whatever country you want to make and the future you want to make. And you look around the world today, and the difference between the countries that succeed and the countries that fail is governance, the quality of government. And actually, we just had a classic example in Ukraine. You wouldn't have this problem in Ukraine if in the 20 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, it had been well governed, with proper effective systems of government and the absence of corruption. So it's the same here in Africa. You govern well, you focus on non-old-fashioned battles of loyalties of the past or colonial left and right arguments of the past. You focus on getting the job done, learning the lessons of what makes effective government, and do it honestly, then you'll make your country roar. And that is absolutely possible and can happen if governments are prepared.